In this video, we'll delve into a crucial yet often overlooked aspect of the COVID-19 lockdown measures, their deeply political nature. These restrictions, framed as purely scientific responses to a health crisis, marked a profound break from the tradition of individual freedom, transferring personal agency into the hands of opaque bureaucratic bodies. Hiding behind the veil of science and public safety, these non-transparent committees and unelected officials enacted sweeping decisions without accountability. Using advanced technological tools like tracking systems and QR codes, they enforced unprecedented controls, experimenting with totalitarian measures that once seemed unthinkable in free societies. Let's explore how this shift unfolded and what it means for our future. Let's explore the influence and impact of Germany's most outspoken critic of lockdown politics, Gunnar Kaiser. Unlike the majority of European intellectuals, Kaiser took a bold early stance against the uncritical acceptance of science as a new form of social authority and the dismantling of core democratic values. He warned that, without fierce and open debate, the global state of emergency was paving the way for a new, bio-political reality, one in which liberal democracy would slowly give way to an encroaching technocratic totalitarianism. Despite his extensive philosophical contributions, which included a well-curated and professionalized YouTube channel alongside 2 best-selling books, Kaiser was largely shunned by the mainstream intellectual discourse. Understanding his role as a public intellectual, Kaiser spearheaded numerous high-profile initiatives, drawing inspiration from the Letter on Justice and Open Debate, signed by 153 predominantly Anglophone intellectuals and published in Harper's Magazine in July 2020, and the Intellectual Dark Web, a network linked to North American figures like Jordan Peterson and Brett and Eric Weinstein. Kaiser launched his own appeal for free debate in autumn 2020. The letter, calling for an end to the intentional defamation of intellectuals, artists, authors, and anyone else who dares to deviate from mainstream public opinion, attracted signatures from around 200 public figures. By spring 2021, as lockdowns stretched into their second year, Kaiser took things a step further by leading a campaign of non-compliance under the slogan, "I'll have no part in it." The questions he posed were provocative. Why is no one rebelling? Why are people allowing all this to be done to them? More than that, why are so many willingly embracing their new shackles? These inquiries forced a necessary confrontation with the truth that the lockdown measures reflected political choices that demanded rigorous scrutiny. Contrary to the often implied narrative, these measures were not acts of nature or unavoidable scientific imperatives. For instance, in a revealing moment on NDR's Coronavirus Update podcast in October 2020, German virologist Christian Drosten stated, "At a certain number of cases, this virus simply compels a lockdown." Drossen's comments absurdly gave the virus its own agency, masking the fundamentally political decisions behind the lockdowns. His remarks epitomize the kind of technocratic doublespeak, or more bluntly, political manipulation, that was rampant during that period. The constant reference to the pandemic itself played a key role in this obfuscation, often unintentionally. Take, for example, a headline from The Economist in September 2020, "The pandemic is plunging millions back into extreme poverty." In such cases, the pandemic becomes a convenient stand-in, or euphemism, for the very lockdowns that disrupted the global economy and led to rising deprivation. The virus made people sick, yes, but it didn't fire them from their jobs, arrest them for visiting the gym, or impose curfews. Those were political actions, not biological inevitabilities. In truth, much of what we've labeled as the pandemic refers not to the actual spread of disease, but to the political responses that reshaped public and private life between 2020 and 2022. This period will be remembered not just for the virus, but for the unprecedented state intervention that defined every facet of daily existence. At the core of this analysis lies the need to comprehend why the rapid and dramatic transformation of society was so readily accepted and what this shift reveals about the current state of civilization and its potential trajectory. These measures represent a test, a trial of society's resilience against totalitarian tendencies. If a society can be so swiftly unnerved, panicked, and frightened, if it relinquishes fundamental rights without resistance, if it acts in blind obedience to authority, if it chooses to comply without questioning the erosion of human dignity for the sake of survival, or freedom in the name of security and health, then such a society becomes dangerously susceptible to totalitarian temptations. Public intellectuals, often referred to as the conscience of the nation, play a crucial role in preserving societal immunity. It is their responsibility to speak out when liberties are restricted, when humanistic values are cast aside, and when obedience to authority becomes the prevailing theme. The sheer magnitude of the revolution experienced overnight in March 2020, both in Germany and across the West, surpassed the boundaries of what anyone could have imagined. On an epistemological level, there has been an inversion from uncertainty as the norm to an era of absolute certainty. Even as official positions changed or contradicted themselves, the facts were presented as incontrovertible: the severity of the virus, the effectiveness of masks, or the necessity of lockdowns. This culture of certainty has bred an increasingly intolerant society. Nothing can be questioned anymore. Those who dare express doubt or inquire about the proportionality of these measures are labeled deniers, or deniers of science, of reality. Questioning, once a pillar of critical thought, has been redefined as morally reprehensible, dangerous, even irresponsible. A key indicator of this shift lies in the reversed burden of proof. It is no longer incumbent on those promoting radical, unprecedented actions to justify them, but instead on those who express caution or skepticism. Those opposed to sweeping changes are portrayed as reckless or careless, while dissenting voices, even from experts, are dismissed as troublemakers or worse. This ethos of absolute certainty, the abolition of doubt in a state of emergency, has led to a narrowing of intellectual debate and public discourse. In ignoring the world's complexity, society becomes blind to unintended consequences and the potential for abuse of power. The second inversion occurs in the realm of judgment, particularly regarding health in the age of lockdowns. No longer are we simply healthy individuals. We are now seen as potentially infectious, possibly sick, even without symptoms. The possibility of infection lingers over all of us, prompting the state to advise, behave as though you are infected, to protect others. This so-called pandemic imperative, described by a German journalist, becomes a secular return of original sin. Infection is no longer an unfortunate event, but a form of assault. Human beings, once defined by autonomy, dignity, and connection, are now reduced to mere vectors, homo contaminans, homo hygienicus. With this profound philosophical shift, humanity's essence is no longer centered around autonomy or intimacy, but on control and regulation. This new framework paves the way for the draconian measures that followed, where the spirit of Enlightenment democracies is undermined. The third inversion revolves around decision-making and agency. No longer is it the individual, the society, or the polity that determines a course of action in this so-called democracy. Instead, decisions are driven by an anonymous virus, a disease, or even a technical app. One of the starkest examples of this comes from the words of America's former chief medical officer, Anthony Fauci. Defending his contradictory advice in June 2021, he claimed, "People who criticize me, quite frankly, are actually criticizing science." Fauci, in this framing, bears no personal responsibility for his decisions, for he is merely a conduit for science. As manipulative as his statements may seem, they embody the impersonal technocratic governance took center stage during the pandemic, with politicians and experts becoming mere instruments of a larger apparatus, an apparatus whose very existence justified and dictated their actions. The advent of PCR testing and vaccination passports, for instance, didn't emerge from thoughtful political discourse but simply because such technologies existed. This illustrates a form of technological determinism, where political and social thought are increasingly dictated by the tools that dominate society, replacing earlier frameworks like Christian doctrines or Enlightenment ideals. The pandemic underscored how this trend runs counter to the principles of a free society, as the logic of machines clashes with human values. The perils of such uncritical faith in technology, especially in scientific or positivist thinking, merit deeper exploration. The final inversion concerns action, specifically, the relationship between the state and the individual. As seen during the lockdowns, this relationship has been thoroughly reversed. The state no longer requests but demands, imposing its will. Meanwhile, citizens are reduced to asking and begging, whether for a shred of freedom, clearer communication, or the restoration of rights. This new dynamic leaves the populace passive, as the overwhelming power of the state creates a sense of suffocating helplessness. What's more disturbing is that this incursion isn't perceived as overreach. State dominance was embraced by many. People willingly participated, complied without critique, and even took pride in their blind obedience. This highlights a cultural shift marked by credulity towards authority and a growing disregard for privacy and liberty. These inversions aren't just political maneuvers but reflect a broader societal climate change. The pandemic era saw the solidification of authoritarian or paternalistic relations between the state and citizens. Amidst collective fear, a form of sanitation terror emerged, with the state positioned as a guardian. Citizens, meanwhile, became infantilized, reduced to the role of obedient children. This infantilization was evident in the state's messaging, which permeated everyday life. Take, for instance, government-commissioned propaganda like the Special Heroes films in Europe, which celebrated passive behavior as heroic. The films glorified young people for doing nothing, staying at home, lounging around, and abandoning any sense of responsibility. This phenomenon underscores yet another inversion. Heroism was redefined as passive obedience, blind trust in authorities, and an overall mentality of dependence. Such attitudes mark a profound break from the Enlightenment ideals that once championed individual responsibility and freedom. As British journalist Brendan O'Neill observed, this crisis represents not just a political transformation but a cultural and civilizational rupture. The notion of a new normal signals that the age of lockdown is a watershed moment in history. Perhaps the most repeated mantra during this era was "Follow the science," or in German-speaking regions, "Trust science." These slogans reveal much about the cultural shift. Science was glorified to the point of near-religious reverence. As one headline in Foreign Policy proclaimed, "The pandemic proves only technocrats can save us." On one hand, these appeals to science lent intellectual legitimacy to lockdown policies, with public health officials rising to prominence as central authorities. Acting in the name of science became the ultimate justification for power, but this sentiment also reveals a deeper truth about modernity's ideological framework. Science, in this context, takes on quasi-religious overtones. The insistence on a scientific consensus mirrors the establishment of a new orthodoxy. Anyone who questions this orthodoxy is labeled a science denier, essentially a heretic challenging the accepted worldview. Ironically, this insistence on settled science violates the very essence of the scientific method, which thrives on skepticism and inquiry. Appeals to authority, reminiscent of the Milgram experiments, have given rise to a pseudo-scientific culture where dissent is delegitimized.
A Senate hearing exploring the origins of COVID-19, and it didn't take long for things to get heated as lawmakers and scholars sparred over what some originally called conspiracy theories.
Saying that what did it come to you overnight?
There was new data that
like a revelation from God. It's amazing.
And that was one of the heated exchanges today as lawmakers grilled Robert Gary. So the Tulane Medical School dean wrote a 2020 article arguing that a lab leak couldn't have sparked this pandemic, which he stood by today, but admits the science has evolved since then.
The crux of the issue is whether science is capable, or even suited, to act as a social or political authority. The answer is clear: it is not.
However, what was once considered a conspiracy theory is now becoming more accepted, that COVID was a result of a lab leak in Wuhan, China. So there was a lot of division today, pointing fingers at the authors who believe the virus is from natural origins, while others claim they ignored other possible theories.
This is the most egregious form of scientific misconduct. Publishing a paper where you know the conclusions are untrue.
Didn't put anything in that paper that we didn't believe was true. That's not fraud, sir. That is just the way that the scientific method works.
Paper.
And meanwhile, a Republican senator is pushing for a 9/11 style commission to investigate the origins of COVID and perhaps classify the virus as a bioweapon. In studio, Talia Cunningham, Fox 31.
Science, as a method, investigates objective reality. It deals with facts and what can be measured. But it cannot define values like freedom, dignity, or companionship. Those belong to the philosophical realm, far beyond the scope of empirical study. In a positivist framework, human beings are reduced to their biological metrics: age, weight, viral load, blood pressure. This reductionist view of humanity, which echoes the concept of Homo hygienicus, lays the groundwork for a new bioethics. By centering politics around the body, the distinction between public and private life dissolves. There's no longer any aspect of life beyond the state's reach. As Austria's Bioethics Commission declared in October 2021, a pandemic is not a private affair. This bioethical view, which turns everything into a matter of public concern, naturally leads to the total collectivization of human life. In such a society, the individual has no space to exist independently, every personal decision becomes a political one. Humanity is reduced to bare life, and the body becomes an object of regulation. Fully realized, biopolitical societies resemble an open-air prison. Regardless of the moral intentions behind such measures, reducing human beings to mere objects of governance is both totalitarian and dehumanizing. Individuals are reduced to cogs in a faceless, nameless bureaucratic machine. This grim prognosis raises a pressing question: what can be done? Assuming we cannot return to the old normal, how can we resist the totalitarian and dehumanizing tendencies of this biopolitical age? The answer lies in rejecting the hubris of technocratic elites. Rather than pursuing utopian goals like zero COVID or net zero, a more humble approach is warranted. Not forwards, but hesitate. Grand attempts to reshape the world often result in more destruction than salvation. This sentiment invites a moment of reflection to consider the world from a distance, untethered by the immediate influences of power and society. Yet, this kind of contemplation is obstructed by the pervasive culture of fear that grips modern discourse. Whether in discussions of virology, environmental crises, or the rise of populism, the prevailing mood is one of looming disaster. This is a form of apocalyptic thinking, or what we might call catastrophism in psychological terms. It fuels the paternalism of the state, locking society into a cycle of fear that suffocates the imagination, an imagination essential for individuals to fully grasp the gravity of their own circumstances. Not all forms of totalitarianism are identical, but they share distinct features. Compelling individuals to publicly display symbols of loyalty to the prevailing ideology is one such feature. Declaring a state of emergency and stripping away constitutional rights without sufficient cause is another. Prohibiting public protests through government edicts, drowning the public in propaganda meant to instill blind obedience, and dividing societies along arbitrary lines, all are hallmarks of totalitarian regimes. Censoring dissent, terminating people's livelihoods for failing to comply with the official narrative, and stirring up mass hatred towards a scapegoated group of citizens, these too are unmistakable signs. When critics of the dominant ideology are demonized and the legal system is weaponized to silence them, the shadow of totalitarianism becomes unmistakable. Now, as the emergency state begins to fade from memory, our responsibility is to remember just how far Europe strayed. We must acknowledge the fracture that the pandemic inflicted on a once proud political tradition, a tradition that has long been a beacon of freedom and human dignity. Influence architects show you human dynamics, unveil propaganda, debunking fake news, shatter illusions, present myths and lies. We unfake and stop fake for you, we show human behavior patterns, we expose how the overlords rule, we work as your influence radar. Our channel will provide regular updates prepared by our team focusing on day-to-day challenges as well as on issues that affect most of us, from financial to career moves, social political pressure, current trends and news propaganda, health, lifestyle and personal relationships negotiations.